Hi, and welcome to my shop tour. Over the last few years, I've gotten a lot of requests to do a proper shop tour. Now, I've done a lot of videos where I've shown parts of the shop or improvements that I've made, but I've really never done a video that walks through the entire process of how I construct things. Now, you might expect that a shop tour would start with, sawdust and machinery, but the reality is my projects actually don't start there at all. They start here in my office. So I've had the opportunity to kind of refurnish everything in the office, and so I brought in a lot of the projects that I actually built in my shop. Here you can see my Susian step stool actually is serving as a small bookshelf where I can even keep my sketchbook where it's close at hand. And my small chest of drawers here has become the perfect organization center for a lot of my video equipment for recording my videos. And probably most important of all is my workspace where I actually work on my designs. Whether it's sitting here and working on some sketches or eventually going over to my desktop computer and putting my concepts into Sketchup and then seeing them kind of in a 3D model. I have a good sized computer screen here, a powerful desktop machine where I can also do my video editing all within one workspace. But once the design is complete, that's when I head down to the actual wood shop itself, and you'll start to see where there's some real advantages that I've found to actually having a shop within my house. Now that you've gotten a chance to see where everything gets started, let's head down to the shop and see where all the real action happens. Well, this is kind of the all-purpose part of the basement. It's actually where my original shop was until I realized that having a bunch of sawdust around my hot water heater and my boiler was probably not a great idea. So that's when I actually built out the current part of the shop. So this is really where a lot of things happen. If I'm doing just kind of general construction projects around the house, this is where most of those tools are, screws and bolts and things like that. Really, around the house kind of tools are all in here. It's also where I kind of work on my bike, but it's also where I do a lot of the hand tool work. So I have kind of my sharpening station set up over here. I've got all of my stones lined up. I'm also working on a smoother plane here that I'll finish maybe someday. And it's also really convenient to have a slop sink down here as well, because obviously I need water for these water stones. And for any finish applications that I use, this is where I come and clean up. I also have my grinder set up down here, so if I do need to grind a new bevel on a plane iron or grind anything for that matter, I can do that here as well. So this is just kind of the all-purpose room. Haven't spent a lot of time on the decor, as you can see. Alright, so enough with the sharpening area. Let's now head over to where the actual woodworking happens. One of the most important things to me when I actually built out my shop was to make sure that dust was going to be contained. My house is actually heated with forced hot air, and so that meant that if anything got into the air ducts or into the furnace system, I'd just be blowing sawdust all over the house. So it was really important for me to button up the parts of the shop where the real dust was being created. To this side is actually where my dimensioning and finishing room is, and to this side is where all of the kind of joinery happens within the shop. And I've designed it that way so that I could actually be, working on a finish on one side while I'm working on the joinery for another project on the other side, and I wouldn't have to worry about dust, contaminating my finish, or dust or finish getting spread out throughout the house. But dust containment really starts at the root, or the source where the dust is created at the tools. So central dust collection was also critical for me. I built this small closet that's actually between the two sections of the shop where I've housed the central dust collector as well as my compressor. Dust collection duties are handled by a JDS Dust Force dust collector, and I've also got it connected to a wireless remote so that I can turn the dust collector on and off from either section of the shop without having to walk over here. And then I do also have a compressor in here. It's just a small Hitachi compressor, but I do have the hose running up through the ceiling into the finishing and assembly section of the shop where I keep all of my nail guns. With that, let's head on into the dimensioning and finish room where most of my projects start in terms of lumber selection. It just makes a lot of sense to store your lumber close by your dimensioning equipment. That means you're not going to be dragging big bulky boards around your shop. So I put in lumber racks here where I've organized all of my stock. When I can, I take a piece of chalk and I'll write on the edge of the board exactly what it is so I don't have to go sorting through the stack. In a lot of cases, once the wood darkens up, it can be a little bit tough to tell what it is just by looking at it. So this gives me kind of an easy access to all of the stock so that I can go through and find the right board for the right part of my project. Typically, once I've selected my stock, I can pull it right out of the rack, and then I have sawhorses stacked right over here that I can put right in the middle of my shop so that I can then take either my jigsaw, which is housed right over here, or even have an electric chainsaw down here for bigger, thicker boards so that I can knock them down to size before I run them through the jointer. Now, oftentimes I find myself working with the jointer and the bandsaw in conjunction. So it made a lot of sense for me to have the bandsaw very nearby. So I've gone from lumber to cutting down my stock to jointer and bandsaw, all within one small area. One of the advantages to a smaller shop. Oftentimes I'm either resawing or I'm ripping my stock down to size on the bandsaw and then I'll bring it right over to the jointer. So it's actually really, really handy. Currently this is the Rikon 14-inch deluxe bandsaw. Eventually I do want to upgrade to an 18-inch bandsaw and I'll just have that as my dedicated bandsaw in here. And then I'll move this into the joinery room where I'll keep a smaller blade on it for doing curved cuts. The jointer is a Powermatic. It's an 8-inch jointer with the helical head. I found that really helps out with figured stock. And I really needed at least an 8-inch jointer because I use a lot of wider boards. I couldn't fit a 12-inch jointer in here. It would just be too massive to fit in my shop. So this was really the perfect tool for the job. It's also the only 220 volt tool that I have in the shop. So I did have 220 volt service run in here. And at the same time, I also had 110 volt service brought in. So I have switched outlets, 3 of them on the ceiling where I can put my shop lighting because I do want to have a lot of lighting in here. And then I also have outlets all around the edges of the shop on all the walls because I found that you can really never have too many outlets in your shop. I do, of course, also have dust collection to all these machines. And I have blast gates right at the mating point where each of the hoses comes into the machine. And I have a rack here where I can store all of my shorter offcuts and then my medium-sized offcuts get stacked back here. And one of my newer additions to the shop is that I have wired for sound in both rooms. And when I get into the joinery room, I'll show you where that all originates from. Over here now on the left side of the jointer is where I have my planer. Obviously you want to have your planer also located near your jointer. I'm typically flattening one surface after going to the bandsaw and the jointer, and then I'm running everything through the planer. So what I did is I put my planer on this little rolling stand. That way, if I need to, I can roll it out into the center of the shop for longer boards, and I can even open this door if I have to run stock that's even longer than that. For the most part, I only have to run it out about this far. It's also low enough that it will not interfere with the top of the jointer. So I'm never really in a situation where my planer and my jointer are getting in each other's way. I mentioned that this room is also where all of the assembly and finish work happens as well, but I'm going to hold off on that until the end in the interest of kind of following the workflow of a typical project. So with that, let's head on over to the joinery room and I'll show you how my setup works in there. So this is what I affectionately call the joinery room. Essentially, everything from the final steps of dimensioning my stock all the way up to applying the finish happens in this room. Here's a bit of a panoramic view just to help orient you for this part of the shop tour. And essentially, I'm going to start out over on this end and work my way counterclockwise back around, and I'll explain my thought process through each of the stages of setting up this section of the shop. If you'll remember back to the beginning of the shop tour when I was up in my office, I had a SketchUp diagram of the project I'm going to be working on next. Because my whole house is networked, I have another computer down here in the shop. I've got a monitor mounted on the wall, and that lets me actually access the exact same file that I was using upstairs on my desktop machine. That way, if I make any changes to a model either upstairs or while I'm back down here, I'm saving it to a single location, and I'm not running back up and down using a thumb drive or anything like that. So it makes sure I'm always looking at the most current version of my project, even when I'm in the shop itself. Down here in the cabinet that supports the keyboard, I can give you a look at what's inside. Now, obviously, a shop collects a lot of dust, so I wanted to have a cabinet to house the electronics in the shop. So down here is the stereo. It's basically my old home theater system I used to use before I got a new one, so I just moved it down here. And then I've got the laptop up here. I also have some of my home networking equipment is stored in there as well. Just happens that the hub to all of my central structured wiring for the entire house comes into this room. So I wanted to have a cabinet where I could keep the dust out of this stuff. I've been fortunate that it stays cool enough in here that I haven't had to add a cooling fan, because then I'd have to add all kinds of additional, filtering mechanisms to keep the dust out. But it stays cool enough down here that I haven't had any issues with overheating. Knock on wood. Moving down the line, I'm now at the router table. This is a GESM router fence. This is the master fence, and this is also a GESM top, which works in conjunction with the fence. It's actually super flexible. There's just these two knobs to adjust, to move back and forth. The fence widens and then tightens down with this handy little wrench, so I can get pretty close to zero clearance on any of my router bits. I've also installed a Triton, I believe it's a 2.5 horsepower or 2.25 horsepower router underneath. And one of the reasons for that is I can do everything above the table. So if I take out this insert here, I can just drop this little handle in here, and I can actually raise the entire blade from above the table if I need to. I can do this from below the table, and it is actually a little faster, to be honest. And then I can just pop the wrench right in here, and I can remove the blade. So it makes switching blades really, really easy. Now on over to the bench area, and this should be a fairly familiar shot if you've seen any of my videos in the past. I will say I did make a change a little bit recently. This bench used to be up against this wall, and I decided both for the purposes of shooting video, this is actually a much easier way to set up kind of the presentation. But I also got tired of having to lean over my bench every time I needed to reach for a tool up here. So now it's a lot easier for me to just turn around, grab the hand tool that I need, and it's right there, easy at hand. It takes up a little bit more room in the shop, but it's just a much better setup overall, so I'm pretty happy with that switch. The bench itself is the 21st century workbench that was designed by Bob Lang of Popular Woodworking. And it was really, I think, the first video project that I did in the shop was the construction of this bench. It's made out of ash entirely. It's nice, solid material, and it's very heavy. It's got the Veritas twin screw vise on the left-hand side. I like this configuration a lot because I do a lot of hand-cut dovetails, and so I can just put my pin boards and tail boards in there, clamp it down, and I've got 30 inches between screws, so I can do dovetailing across a pretty wide board. And then I've just got a quick vise on the end here. I'm not even sure what brand it is. It's kind of the generic thing that they sell at Veritas or Lee Valley. And that's just essentially what I use for anything else that I need to do on the bench in terms of holding material down. I've also got one of the Veritas hold downs or hold fasts as well that I can drop in any of the dog holes. So between those vices and that clamp, I can pretty much lock down anything I need to work on. Going behind the bench, this is my hand tool cabinet that I also built a few years back. It houses my hand saws and the majority of my hand planes, as well as some of my measuring and marking tools. And as we pan down, it's really more chisels and spoke shaves and various other kind of hand tool components that I use on a fairly regular basis. Again, all housed right behind the workbench to make it really easy for me to access everything. Continuing around, I had another little nook in this corner of the shop, so I basically just made a closet out of it. So I took some bifold doors, actually originally from my bedroom before I upgraded them, and this is kind of where I store a lot of stuff in here that I don't have any other place for. I've tried my best to organize it, but I frankly could do a better job. I've got some sort of shelving units here from Staples, and that's where I just organize the different grits of my sandpaper. I've got some wax in here. First aid kit, really important in any shop. Usually I'm just coming over here to grab a Band-Aid after I've nicked myself with a chisel. I'm trying to do some organization here with all of my, I've got all the sort of manuals for all of my power tools, as well as some catalogs that I reference. Some additional power tools, a power drill, another palm sander. I also have a handheld belt sander in here, vacuum press, the router jig for doing dovetails. So kind of just random stuff that I really don't have any other place for, but I can put in the closet and keep relatively dust free. To my right, I have my drum sander, which has been a lifesaver for a few projects that I've done in the past, where something's been just too wide to send through my planer, or trying to sand it using a random orbit sander was just going to be way too much work. You could definitely argue that this is more of a dimensioning tool, and in a lot of cases it is. I could definitely make the case for putting this in the dimensioning room instead of in here. But I do most of my sanding in here, and as you're going to see in a minute, I also have a ceiling mounted dust filter in here, which is great to have if you are kicking up a lot of dust with things like a random orbit sander or a drum sander. If I pan up here, you can see I've got a ceiling mounted jet dust filter up here. It operates on a remote control so that I can turn it on or off from any part of my shop. It also has a timer on it, so I can leave it running for 2 hours even after I leave the shop to pick up all those, really fine, 1 micron particles in the shop. But that's turned out to work great for any operation where I can't get great dust collection at the source. It at least clears all those dangerous small particles out of the air pretty quickly. Well, speaking of not being able to get great dust collection at the source, this is my Makita sliding compound miter saw. Actually, one of the earlier pieces of equipment I bought in the shop. I've had it for a while now, and I've really liked it a lot. I think it's super accurate. I get a really, really crisp cut. I still use the Makita blade that came with this thing, and it's just ultra high quality blade, 70 teeth. I've had it sharpened a few times, but it's probably one of the best sort of stock blades I've seen on any tool that I've bought. You'll notice this is almost directly below the air filter, and that's not a mistake. I've just never been able to get great dust collection. I do have a dust hose connected to it. It does have a dust port, but on a pretty regular basis, I have to go back there and pretty much sweep out, 3 inches of dust that have collected from shooting out the back of the miter saw. Which brings me over to the table saw. It's a Steel City saw. It does run on 110 volts, so it's a little bit, not quite as high powered as it would be if I had a 220. I like everything about the saw, although this was one of the last models that was on the market before riving knives became mandatory on table saws in the US. So I might consider making an upgrade at some point. Probably want to wait and see how the flesh detecting technology thing turns out, whether that becomes mandatory. If so, I'll probably want to get something that has that as well, just so that I'm completely compliant all the way around. I've also got some shelves built over here where I can store essentially all of the jigs I use for the table saw, my tenoning jig up here, and then my dado stack, different blades, different inserts, as well as my feather boards, push sticks, safety glasses. All that's within arm's reach of the saw to make it, really, really convenient. I also have my miter gauge, which gets stored right on the side of the saw, so that's easy to access as well. That's the Incra 1000 SE. That pretty much wraps up this room. So now I'm going to head back to the other room where I'm going to show you how my assembly and finish process works. Now I'm back over in kind of the finish and assembly section of the shop. Once I have everything sanded to its final grit over in the joinery room, I bring it back in here where the dimensioning happened in the first place. This is where I store all of my clamps. I've got a clamp rack against this back wall here, and I also have some additional clamps that are hanging above this shelf where I keep all of my finishes. Because this is a pretty buttoned up, unventilated area being in a basement, I really don't have the luxury of using any kind of harmful finishes at all. So I've moved almost exclusively either to water-based finishes or shellac for everything that I do. I do have a sprayer that I use in here, but because I'm not using any VOC-based solutions or finishes, that's fine. I would say that if you are going to use something like a lacquer or even an oil-based finish, a basement setting is not the right place to do that. But I've found that the water-based finishes have gotten so good now that I really don't have any problem using them on almost everything. And just a look over at my actual assembly and finish table. This is based on the design that Mark Spagnolo came up with on the woodwhisperer.com. I actually just scaled it down a little bit so that it would fit my shop. It is on locking casters as well, so I can move this around if I need to, if I have something bigger I need to work on. I've also used this in some cases. I'll put some foam insulation on top of it, and then I can use my track saw directly on this as well for cutting down larger sheet goods, for example. I've done what I think is a fairly decent job of organization. I've got a lot of kind of additional finishes and dyes in this bottom drawer here, as well as some waxes and other things. And then, this is basically just my rag drawer. I'm constantly, reaching for a fresh rag. I also have my latex gloves in here, a couple of bins of hardware, and then up top I've got things like acid brushes and little plastic cups and squirter bottles and other brushes and scissors and things like that I need to be able to access quickly and easily. And then in the cabinet over here to the right is where I store all of my nail guns. So I've got 4 different size nail guns, a jigsaw. I've also got all of my brads and pneumatic nails also go in here. And as I mentioned before, I do have a compressor that's in that dust collection closet. And there's a drop that comes out right above this assembly table, so I can just attach this coiled hose and hook up any of my nail guns. So I kind of have everything pretty well organized here in a fairly small and confined space. Well, that's my shop. I hope you enjoyed the shop tour. Maybe you saw something that'll work in your shop, or you learned something that might actually help you with your workflow. But this is the kind of space that works for me and works for the kind of woodworking that I like to do.